Emma had always dreamt of escaping the noise, the chaos, and the relentless pace of city life. The constant honking of car horns, the buzz of neon lights, the rush of people, everything had become overwhelming. So when the opportunity arose to buy an old house in the country, she jumped at the chance. It was everything she'd wanted, quiet, secluded, and full character. The house sat on a hill surrounded by fields, its weathered exterior holding a strange, quiet charm. The moment she stepped into the house, Emma felt a sense of relief wash over her. The air was fresh, the room spacious and airy. She could already imagine the warm evenings spent reading by the fireplace, or sitting on a porch with a cup of tea, listening to the rustling of leaves. It was perfect, just as she had envisioned. The house was a little older than she'd anticipated. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and dust clung to every surface. But it had a history, a soul. The former owners had left it behind after some tragic incident, and there were rumors among the locals that the house had been abandoned for decades. Emma didn't mind. She wasn't afraid of a little dust or the occasional squeak. After all, she was used to the impersonal, sterile environments of modern apartments in the city. This house felt alive, somehow, with its crooked walls and old wooden beams. She spent the first few days unpacking and getting settled, excited to begin her new life. There was no rush. The house felt timeless, and Emma reveled in the slower pace of life. Yet on the third night, something unsettling happened. It was late, and Emma was sitting in the living room, sipping tea, when she heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. She froze, the cup trembling in her hands. The house was old, after all. It could be the pipes, the settling of the wood, or just the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Emma laughed it off, dismissing it as nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But the next night, the whisper came again. Only this time it was clearer. It sounded like a voice, soft, pleading, as though it were coming from the very earth beneath her feet. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stood up, walking cautiously to the center of the room, listening intently. The voice was faint, but it was undeniably there, a shiver-inducing murmur that sent chills crawling up her spine. "Help me!" The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her breath quickened as she looked around the room, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The voice was gone as suddenly as it had appeared, but the feeling of unease lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. She tried to push the incident out of her mind. It was probably just the wind, or maybe the house was settling again. But over the following days, the whispers continued, soft at first, almost imperceptible, and then louder, more urgent. Sometimes they would come when she was alone in the kitchen, other times when she was lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep. The words were always the same. "Help me." By the fifth day, Emma's nerves were fraying. She had already checked the house for any signs of structural damage, but found nothing. No hidden compartments, no secret passages. Nothing that could explain the whispers. But the more she tried to ignore them, the more persistent they became, until they were impossible to ignore. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the voices echoing in her mind. One afternoon, after a sleepless night, Emma decided to take a walk to the small town nearby. She needed answers, something to explain the growing sense of dread that had begun to consume her. She wandered into the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on the house's history. After speaking to the librarian, a quiet, elderly woman named Mrs. Mallory, Emma was directed to an old, dusty shelf in the back corner. The books were old, their pages yellowed and fragile. She pulled one from the shelf, its title barely legible, but the cover was enough to make her pause. The Tragedy of the Hawthorne Estate. Curious, Emma flipped open the book and began reading. The story was one of tragedy. The house had once belonged to the Hawthorne family, a wealthy and prominent family in the area. But the story took a dark turn when, nearly 40 years ago, the family mysteriously vanished without a trace. Rumors swirled about their disappearance. Some said they had been murdered. Others claimed they had fled in the middle of the night, abandoning the house for reasons unknown. But the most chilling part of the story was a mention of strange happenings within the house before they disappeared. Whispers from beneath the floorboards. A family member, a young girl named Sarah, had been heard calling for help, pleading to be freed from something beneath the house. The last entry in the journal was a cryptic note. "We made a terrible mistake. The house, it wants us." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up from the book, her heart racing. Could the whispers she had been hearing be connected to the Hawthorne family? To Sarah? The house had been abandoned for decades, but the voices seemed to be growing stronger, more desperate, as though something or someone was trying to communicate with her. When Emma returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. They came from every corner of the house, as though the very walls were alive, breathing in unison with the voices beneath. That night, the whispers grew to a frantic crescendo, and Emma couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a crowbar from the garage and began prying up the floorboards in the living room. Sweat dripped down her brow, her heart pounding in her chest as she tore at the wood, desperate to uncover whatever lay hidden beneath. When the last board came loose, Emma peered into the dark, empty space below. But there was nothing there. No treasure, no hidden secrets. Only dust and the smell of decay. And yet, as she stood there, staring into the void beneath the floor, the whispers stopped. A deep, suffocating silence fell over the room, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Emma wondered the house had finally claimed her. Then, as if responding to her thoughts, the voice returned. This time, it was not a whisper. "Leave." It was a command, clear and forceful, and Emma knew, without a doubt, that she was not alone in the house. The darkness beneath the floorboards was not empty. It was waiting for her. Emma bolted from the house, never to return. The town would talk, of course. Whispers were spread about the woman who had fled the Hawthorne estate in fear. But Emma knew one thing for certain. The house was not empty. The voices had been calling for her. And when they called again, they would call for someone else. The house on the hill would never be silent again. Emma lay in bed, staring up at the peeling ceiling, her body bathed in the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains. The house, as always, was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling beneath her. For the past few days, she had been trying to convince herself that the house's strange noises were nothing more than the natural settling of an old building. It was peaceful here, calm, exactly what she had wanted when she fled the city, searching for some semblance of quiet. But tonight, the silence felt heavier than usual. She tossed and turned, tugging at the blanket as the oppressive quiet gnawed at her. Then, just as she was about to drift off, a faint sound pierced the stillness. A soft, barely audible whisper. Emma froze. It came from beneath the floorboards. At first, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. The wind, the old pipes, the house settling, anything but something unnatural. She rolled over, burying her head into the pillow, trying to push the sound out of her mind. But the whisper returned, louder this time. "Help me?" Her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes snapped open, wide with disbelief. She lay perfectly still, the world around her suddenly feeling like a suffocating weight pressing against her chest. The whisper had been clear, unmistakable. So clear that it didn't feel like it came from the walls at all, but from beneath her own bed. It was no figment of her imagination. Emma slowly sat up, the floorboards creaking beneath her as she moved. She glanced around the room, her heart pounding in her chest. her limbs heavy with fear. There was no one there, nothing unusual. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of someone watching her. The voice came again, weaker this time, but no less chilling. "Help me?" It was barely a breath, a raspy, desperate sound that seemed to seep from the wood itself. She felt it more than heard it, like the floorboards themselves were vibrating with the anguish of the plea. Emma's pulse quickened. She felt cold, as though the warmth of the room had been leached from her body, leaving nothing but the gnawing chill of dread. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the old hardwood floor was worn and cracked. The faintest traces of dust still lingered in the cracks, remnants of the house's years of neglect. Could something be hidden beneath there? She wondered. But then another thought pierced her mind, a thought she wished she hadn't entertained. What if it's not a thing under the floorboards, but someone? The air felt thick, like the very space around her was heavy with secrets, with things that had been buried and forgotten. Emma's throat was dry, and she could taste the salt of fear on her tongue. Every part of her screamed to ignore the voice, to stay in bed, to pretend it wasn't real. But something, the terrifying possibility of something, someone trapped beneath her, compelled her to act. She stood up, her knees weak, and walked cautiously to the center of the room. Her hand hovered over the wooden planks beneath her, trembling as though the very floor might reach out and grab her. But she forced herself to move, her fingers brushing against the dusty floor, feeling the grooves of the uneven boards. The whisper came again, louder now. "Help me?" It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was strained, desperate. There was a faint wetness in the voice, like someone choking on their own breath. Who could it be? Her pulse thudded in her ears as she bent down, one hand gripping the edge of the floorboard nearest the corner of the room. Her body tense with the anticipation of whatever might be lurking below. Could it be an animal? No, the sound was far too human. It was too specific, too pleading, too full of torment. Emma ran her fingers over the edges of the wooden floorboard, searching for a weak spot. As she did, she noticed something strange, a small, discolored gap in the grain, as though it would have been tampered with. Her stomach twisted. Could there be a hidden compartment beneath it? Her heart raced as she grabbed the nearest tool from the small toolbox she'd left in the corner, an old crowbar she'd found in the shed. The metal felt cold in her hands as she inserted it between the gap in the floorboards. With a slight grunt, she pulled. The board resisted at first, but then cracked, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Emma's breath hitched as she pried the board loose, revealing a dark cavity beneath. She knelt down, staring into the space. The shadows seemed to stretch down into infinity, and a rancid smell wafted up from the opening. A mixture of rot and something else. Her stomach churned. Then the whisper came again. It was louder this time, almost frantic. "Please, help me." The voice was clearer now. Not just a whisper, but a cry, a desperate plea that seemed to echo through her bones. Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight with a combination of fear and empathy. Whatever was down there, whoever was calling for help, they were real. Without thinking, she reached into the darkness, her hands trembling as she gripped the sides of the opening. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to leave, to call someone. But she couldn't. She needed to know. She had to know what was beneath her feet. Her fingers brushed against something soft, something wet. She gasped, pulling her hand back in shock, her heart racing. And then something moved in the darkness. Emma jumped back, her breath coming in short. Frantic bursts as her eyes widened in terror. Something was down there, something alive. She could feel it, moving just out of sight. The whisper didn't stop. "Help me, please." Her mind was reeling. Was it a person? A trapped soul? Or something far darker? The shadows seemed to stretch farther, pulling her into their depths, whispering her name. beckoning her into the void. The door to the room slammed shut. Emma spun around, her heart skipping a beat. The room was cold now, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The whispers were no longer coming from beneath the floor. They were all around her. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against her from all sides. "Help me?" The voice whispered again, but now it was no longer distant. It was right beside her, as though someone was standing in the room with her. And then the floor beneath her feet groaned. Emma's feet clicked against the cold pavement as she walked down the main street of the tiny town. The weight of the house and the voices within it pressed down on her chest. Her mind was consumed by the strange whispers beneath the floorboards, the desperate plea for help that still echoed in her mind. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers. Something about the house, the air, the history, the way it seemed to pulse with the voices, felt wrong. As she approached the library, an old stone building tucked between a cafe and a small post office, she hesitated for just a moment. The library was quiet, unassuming, and somewhat isolated from the rest of the town, just like the house. The irony wasn't lost on her. She needed to understand the history of the house, and this was the only place in town that might hold any answers. The locals were tight-lipped, and she'd heard no mention of the house from anyone, as though they were deliberately avoiding the topic. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked on its hinges, and stepped into the dimly lit library. The air inside was musty with the scent of old paper, a familiar smell that made her feel oddly at ease. The librarian, a silver-haired woman with round glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked up from behind the front desk. Her eyes seemed to widen slightly at the sight of Emma, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Can I help you, dear?" the librarian asked in a soft voice. Emma nodded, glancing around at the rows of shelves, all crammed with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. "I'm looking for some information about a house. Well, about a family who used to live in the Hawthorne estate." The librarian's face tightened for a brief second before her expression returned to neutral. She didn't immediately respond, which made Emma feel as though she had asked something wrong. "The Hawthorne estate?" the librarian repeated slowly, her voice almost a whisper. That's quite a story, if you're sure you want to know." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't I be?" The librarian hesitated, glancing around the room, as though to make sure no one else was listening. "It's a story that people around here don't often like to talk about. Some things are better left forgotten." Emma felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she pressed on. "I need to know. I moved into the house recently, and strange things have been happening." The librarian nodded, her gaze softening. "I see," she murmured. "Well, if you're determined to know, you can find what you need in the back corner of the library, the old records section. The history of the Hawthorne family is, well, it's buried in there, too." With a final, lingering look, the librarian gestured toward the back of the library, where rows of dusty, leather-bound volumes stood in stark contrast to the newer, more accessible books. Emma nodded in thanks and made her way down the narrow aisle, the silence of the room pressing in around her. The farther she walked, the more oppressive the air became. She felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, as if the library itself were watching her, waiting for her to uncover something it didn't want her to know. Emma shook the thought off as she reached the back corner, where an old wooden table sat under a single light bulb that buzzed faintly. She ran her fingers over the spines of the dusty books, feeling the weight of history in the air. She pulled out a thick, faded book that seemed older than the rest, its cover cracked and worn with time. The title was nearly illegible, but she could just make out the words. The Tragedy of the Hawthorne Family. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly, and began to read. The Hawthorne estate had once been a grand home, perched on a hill just outside the town. It was a symbol of wealth and prestige, built by the Hawthorne family in the late 1800s. The patriarch of the family, Jonathan Hawthorne, was a successful businessman who made his fortune in timber. His wife, Evelyn, was known for her charity work and the lavish social events they hosted in their sprawling mansion. They had 2 children, a son named William and a daughter named Sarah. For years, the Hawthorne family was the heart of the community, admired by everyone who knew them. But one night, everything changed. The book's pages were yellowed and brittle, but the story that unfolded was unsettling. One stormy evening, the entire family vanished without a trace. The servants who worked at the estate reported hearing strange noises coming from the house the night before. Whispers, a woman's cry for help. But when the authorities arrived, they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no clues, just an empty house, as though the family had simply evaporated into thin air. Rumors quickly spread through the town, each one more chilling than the last. Some claimed that the family had been murdered in cold blood by an unknown intruder. Others whispered that they had fled in the middle of the night, escaping something far worse than death. But the most unsettling rumor, the one that persisted even decades later, was that the Hawthorne estate was cursed. The family's disappearance remained an open mystery for years, with no new leads or discoveries. Some locals believed that the house itself was responsible for their vanishing. They said that the house was alive, that it trapped souls within its walls, feeding off the fear and torment of its inhabitants. The Hawthorne family, the most prosperous of them all, had apparently become its latest victims. The book mentioned something strange in its final pages, a note scrawled hastily in pencil, as if added long after the original text had been printed. It read, "We made a terrible mistake. The house is not just a home, it is a prison. Beneath the floorboards, beneath the foundation, there is something dark that lives there. We thought we could control it. We were wrong." The note trailed off into nothingness, and Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The last family member to leave had written this, but it was too late. The house had claimed them all. Emma closed the book with a trembling hand, her mind spinning. The whispers, the voice beneath the floorboards, had been right all along. The Hawthorne family hadn't just vanished. They had been taken, trapped by whatever dark force resided in the house. She stood up, her legs weak beneath her, and looked back at the librarian, who was now watching her from across the room. The older woman's eyes seemed to hold a warning, a silent plea for Emma to turn back, to leave the house behind. But Emma couldn't. She had no more. The whispers had drawn her in, and now she understood. They were the voices of the lost, the trapped, the tormented. Whatever had claimed the Hawthorne family had been waiting for her all along. The house was calling. It wasn't going to let her leave, not until she, too, had become part of its dark history. As Emma walked out of the library, the weight of the truth pressed down on her shoulders. The house was not just old, it was alive, and it wanted something from her. The whispers would never stop, not until she found out what lay beneath the floorboards. And deep down, she knew there was no turning back now. It was early morning when Emma first noticed it. The sun had just begun to peek through the thin curtains, casting a pale light across the living room. She stood at the kitchen counter, her hand shaking as she stirred her coffee. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick with something she couldn't quite place. She'd been trying to ignore the whispers for days now, but they were becoming harder to escape. At night, they would come, soft and indistinct at first, like the flutter of a moth's wings against the walls. But recently, the voices had grown louder. They were no longer confined to the dead of night. As she turned away from the counter, a faint sound drifted toward her, no louder than a breath. It was so quiet at first that she thought it might have been a trick of the wind, the house settling in the heat of the morning. But then the sound came again, clearer this time. Help! Emma froze. Her pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing there, someone who might explain the source of the voice. But there was no one. The room was empty, the morning light spilling across the floorboards, untouched. She took a shaky breath and turned back toward the kitchen, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just her nerves, frayed from sleepless nights and the weight of living alone in a house that seemed to grow darker every day. But the whisper came again. "Help me, please." This time, the voice was clearer. It wasn't a vague murmur. It was full of pain, desperation, a plea. Emma's heart clenched as she looked down at the floorboards beneath her feet. They seemed to pulse with an energy that made her skin prickle, as though the house itself was alive and breathing. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the dread creeping up her spine. When she opened her eyes, she could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She glanced at the hallway leading into the other rooms. The house was still, but it wasn't empty. It never was anymore. The whispers were louder now, not just at night, not just when she was alone. They followed her, circled her, like shadows in the corners of her vision. They were always there, at the edge of her consciousness, just out of reach but impossible to ignore. It was the next day when it happened again. She had spent the morning cleaning out the dusty attic, trying to make some semblance of order in the house. Her fingers were raw from rummaging through old crates and boxes, throwing out forgotten trinkets and the brittle remnants of someone else's past. As she pulled the last box in the corner, she paused, a strange feeling crawling down her back. She didn't know why, but something about the attic felt wrong, like it was hiding something. Then a whisper, "Help!" It was right beside her. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. She was alone in the attic. She had been alone the entire time, but there was no mistaking it. The voice was right there, in the corners of the room, behind the stacks of old books and furniture. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a long moment, she didn't move. Her body was frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the need to understand what was happening. The whispers had become more than just sound. They were a presence, a living, breathing thing lurking in the dark corners of her house. And now, they were following her through the day. "Please help." The voice was louder now, frantic, like someone crying out for rescue. The pleading tone was unmistakable, a sound full of desperation and fear. Emma's hands trembled as she dropped the box she was holding, its contents spilling out in a chaotic mess. She took a step backward, her pulse roaring in her ears, and then another. The room was closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of unseen eyes, unseen hands, pressing against her. Without thinking, Emma bolted out of the attic, her breath ragged as she descended the stairs 2 at a time. She reached the bottom and stopped, gasping for air. She hadn't heard the whisper again, but she could feel the echoes of it inside her skull. "Help me, please, help me." It was etched into her mind, like a song that wouldn't stop playing. She didn't know where the voices were coming from. They didn't make sense. The house didn't make sense. It felt as though it was feeding on her fear, her confusion, her isolation. The more she tried to dismiss the whispers, the louder they became, until they were no longer confined as shadows, but filled every corner of the house, reaching for her at all hours of the day. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, the whispers curling at the edges of her mind like smoke. It was nearly impossible to tell if they were real or just a trick of her exhausted brain. She had tried everything, playing music, turning on lights, even sitting outside for hours, but nothing made the voices go away. They were always there, lingering just out of reach. And then, as she lay there, a new sound joined the whispers, a scratching, a rhythmic tapping, like claws tapping against the wood. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she shot upright in bed. The tapping was coming from beneath her feet, beneath the floorboards. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to see it. She couldn't take it anymore. The voices, the scratching, it was all too much. She couldn't ignore it, couldn't push it down any longer. Whatever was hidden beneath the floorboards, whatever was calling to her, it was real. Emma stumbled out of bed, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floor as she rushed to the living room. She grabbed the crowbar from the corner where she had left it earlier, the cold metal pressing against her palm. Without hesitation, she bent down and began prying at the boards, the screeching noise filling the room, mixing with the scratching below. The air was thick with the sound of it, like something scraping, gnawing, desperate to escape. The boards resisted at first, but Emma's panic made her stronger. She pulled harder, her breath quick and shallow, until the first board popped loose, followed by another. Beneath the floor, the darkness seemed to deepen, and the scratching grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like something alive, something clawing its way to the surface. Her heart was in her throat as she pried the last board away. She stared down into the dark hole beneath, where a faint, sickly smell began to rise. But it wasn't empty. There was something there, something moving in the shadows. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could feel its presence, something watching her. And then from the darkness came a voice. "Help me?" The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, gurgling, as if it were coming from somewhere far deeper than the floor itself. It sent a shock of ice through her veins, and Emma recoiled instinctively, the crowbar slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was a pair of pale, outstretched hands emerging from the shadows beneath the floorboards. The first time it happened, Emma thought she had simply misplaced the keys. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She had set them down on the kitchen counter. Just a moment ago, she was sure of it. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the cluttered countertop, and she'd been preparing her usual morning coffee. But when she turned back from the sink to grab her keys, they were gone. She checked the counter. Nothing. The kitchen drawers? Empty. She even opened the refrigerator, just in case. I must be losing it, she thought, feeling a pang of irritation. It was such a trivial thing, the keys, but when she couldn't find them anywhere, an unsettling unease crawled up her spine. After a frantic search through the entire kitchen, Emma sighed in frustration and left the house to run a quick errand, hoping that some fresh air might clear her head. As she stepped back into the house later, she noticed something strange. There, on the entryway table, resting next to the vase of wilting flowers, were her keys, exactly where she had left them the day before. Her breath caught in her throat. The keyring jingled as she picked them up, her fingers trembling. She didn't know why, but it felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. How did they get there? Shaking it off, she chalked it up to forgetfulness. She was tired. Her mind had been consumed with the constant whispers, the eerie sound of voices beneath the floorboards. She hadn't slept properly in days. It was all starting to blur together, dreams, reality, her waking moments blending into a suffocating haze. But then the next day, it happened again. This time, it was her favorite mug, a simple white ceramic cup, one she bought at a small shop in the city. She loved it because it had a small, delicate design of a bird in flight etched into the side. It was always in the same spot, on the windowsill above the sink. But when she reached for it, it was gone. Emma froze, her pulse quickening. She checked the windowsill, the countertops, and even the living room, where she sometimes brought her coffee. Nothing. It wasn't in the cabinets or the cupboards. The mug was simply gone. A cold dread began to settle in her stomach. She had just used it this morning, hadn't she? Her mind felt foggy, as though reality was beginning to warp. She searched the entire house, every room, every drawer. Nothing. She went outside, hoping she might have left on the porch, but the mug wasn't there either. In a panic, she ran her hand through her hair. This is ridiculous, she thought. It's just a mug. I'll find it. I'm just tired. But as night fell, the mug appeared. It wasn't where she'd left it. It was on the bathroom floor in the center of the room. The door had been locked, and she had checked the bathroom several times throughout the day. There was no way the mug could have ended up there. Emma knelt down, her knees weak with dread, and picked up the cup. The handle felt unnaturally cold in her hand, and the bird design seemed to stare back at her, more ominous than she had ever remembered it. Her skin prickled. She tried to ignore the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion or stress. Maybe I just didn't notice. She had no other explanation. But then, the whispers grew louder. They had always been there, faint and insistent in the background. But now, they were more frequent, more demanding, like an endless tide of murmurs that wouldn't stop. Help me? She was sure the voice was coming from the floor beneath her feet. It was faint at first, like a scratch against her eardrum, but as the days went on, the whispers started to rise. She began hearing them when she was alone, when she was in the shower, when she was cooking dinner. Sometimes they seemed to come from the walls, or even from the corners of the room. At times, the voice was distant. Other times, so close she could almost feel breath on her skin. And then, 2 days later, her book disappeared. It was a small thing, too. The Haunting of Hill House, a tattered paperback she'd been reading in the evenings to distract herself from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She had placed it on the coffee table in the living room the night before, intending to pick it up after breakfast. But now, as she sat down, it wasn't there. Not again, she thought, a sick feeling rising in her stomach. She combed to the living room, under the couch cushions, in the kitchen, and in the laundry room. She checked every corner of the house, from the basement to the attic. It was gone. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, Emma's frustration boiled over. She collapsed onto the couch, exhausted, her mind unraveling with the fear that someone was playing tricks on her. Maybe she had misplaced a book. Maybe it was under the bed or in the guest room. But there was a nagging sensation in the back of her mind. What if it wasn't misplaced? What if it was taken? And then, just as she was about to give up, the book reappeared. It wasn't where she had left it. It wasn't even in the living room. The book was now sitting on the windowsill of the attic, staring out at the empty, overgrown field beyond the house. Emma stood at the base of the stairs, staring up at the attic, her breath frozen in her chest. She hadn't gone up there all day. No one had been up there. The book was sitting there, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The whispers flared, louder this time, urgent. Please. Her heart thudded in her chest as she climbed the stairs toward the attic. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a long moment before pushing it open. The stale air hit her immediately. The smell of old dust and something else, something musty, thick. She stepped into the room, and the book was exactly where it had been, on the windowsill. The pages fluttered as though disturbed by an unseen wind. Emma reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the book's cover. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart was racing. She didn't want to believe it, but the house, it was messing with her. She felt her mind slip, her thoughts unraveling as she turned in a slow circle. The whispers were relentless now. She couldn't ignore them, couldn't escape them. They were in the walls, in the floorboards, inside her head. The house wasn't just old. It was alive, playing with her. Each object, each missing item, each strange return was part of something darker, something deeper that was waiting to consume her. The air in the attic felt too thick. She reached for the door, ready to leave, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed her like a trail of cold breath, closing in on her every step. "Help me?" And then, just as Emma turned to run, she saw something in the corner of the attic. Something she hadn't noticed before. Something moving. A shadow, small and jagged, creeping from the darkness. It was almost as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to realize the truth. Nothing in this place ever disappears. It started as a faint sensation, something she couldn't quite grasp, but that crept up on her nonetheless. At first, Emma dismissed it as her imagination, frayed by the sleepless nights and the growing unease that had consumed her since moving into the Hawthorne estate. But tonight was different. Tonight, as she lay in bed, the feeling settled over her like a thick, suffocating fog. She was staring up at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down, when she felt it, a weight in the room, a heavy, unseen presence. Her heart began to race, and her fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket. The soft rustle of the old house, settling in the night, was familiar by now. Creaks in the floorboards, the occasional groan of the walls. But this was something else. The house was still, too still. Emma slowly turned her head, her eyes scanning the corners of the room. The pale light from the window cast long shadows across the walls. But there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just darkness. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. It was as though something was watching her. Something unseen. Something that had been waiting for her to notice. Her skin crawled, her breath coming faster. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against her, suffocating her with its weight. She swallowed hard and pulled the blanket closer around her, trying to find some comfort in the small cocoon of warmth. But the more she tried to push the feeling away, the more it seemed to intensify. The temperature in the room dropped. "It's just a draft," she told herself, but even she couldn't convince herself of that anymore. The cold wasn't natural. It seeped into her bones, a deep, unsettling chill that made her skin break out in goosebumps. It felt wrong, unnatural. Her eyes darted around the room again. The shadows were moving, shifting. She blinked once, twice. It was hard to tell if it was just a dim light playing tricks on her, or if something was actually there. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to calm herself. When she opened them again, the shadows were still there, twisting and warping, stretching unnaturally against the walls. "Stop it, Emma. It's just your mind. You're exhausted. You're overthinking everything." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. There was something wrong with the house. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was alive. It breathed, it watched, and it listened. She had begun to suspect this in the weeks she'd been here. But now, as she lay frozen in her bed, the feeling was undeniable. Suddenly, the whispers came again, this time much louder, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves known. They were no longer distant and fragmented. No, now they were right next to her, pressing into her mind like 1,000 voices, speaking in unison. "Help me?" The voice was distorted, garbled, as if coming from somewhere far deeper than the floorboards. She gasped, clutching her pillow to her chest as her breath caught in her throat. Her heart was pounding now, a frantic, erratic beat that echoed in her ears. "Please, make it stop," she thought desperately. She looked to the floor, the edges of the room starting to blur. The walls seemed to stretch, pulse, as though the house itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with her panicked heart. Emma's eyes darted around again, but there was no source to the voices. No shadow, no figure, no explanation. Just a suffocating presence in the room. as though the very walls were watching her. The cold intensified, and the whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Her thoughts, once clear and focused, began to fracture. What's real? She asked herself. What's just my mind? She could feel it now. The boundary between the real world and the world of the whispers was dissolving. She couldn't tell if the shadows in the corner were moving, or if her eyes were simply playing tricks on her. She couldn't tell if the whispers were real, or if they were just a fragment of her imagination, twisted by the stress of living alone in this accursed house. But something inside her knew. The house was changing her. It was bending reality, warping her perception until she no longer knew what was true. Emma squeezed her eyes shut again, trying to block out the whispers. But when she opened them, she saw something else, something terrifying. The shadows and corners of the room had shifted, coalesced into a darker form. A figure, almost human in shape, crouched at the edge of her bed, just out of her reach. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the form. It had no face, only a shifting mass of shadows that swirled like smoke, but Emma could feel it. Its eyes were on her. She could feel the coldness emanating from it, like an icicle slowly piercing her chest. It reached out a long, skeletal hand toward her, its fingers elongated and unnatural. "Help me?" The voice again. But this time, it was more desperate and more personal. The figure's presence was suffocating, its grip tightening around her mind. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls shrinking, the air thickening. She felt like she was being suffocated by the house itself, like it was pressing in from every side, holding her captive. Her body refused to move. She was paralyzed, unable to scream, unable to run. The figure in the shadows leaned closer, its outline flickering and shifting. She couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just an illusion, a hallucination caused by the stress, the fear, the paranoia. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The whispers faded into the distance, leaving behind a deafening silence. The room was still, almost too still. Emma's breathing was ragged, her chest tight. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but it didn't help. The air was still cold, the room still heavy with presence. She turned her head slowly, her gaze falling to the spot where the shadow had been. The corner was empty now, but the sensation remained. The house was alive. She could feel it now, feel its heartbeat, feel its hunger. She reached for the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling as she flicked the switch. The light bathed the room in a dull glow, pushing back the shadows, but it didn't calm her. No, the house was still there, waiting, watching. The whispers had stopped, but Emma knew they weren't gone. They were just silent for now. She lay back in bed, but sleep didn't come. The lines between what was real and what was imagined were so thin now, so blurred, that Emma couldn't trust her own senses. She couldn't tell if the house was playing tricks on her, or if it was something far darker, something that had always been there, hiding beneath the floorboards, waiting for the right moment to show itself. All she knew was that she was no longer alone in the house. And whatever it wasn't just watching her, it was waiting. The room was darker than usual when Emma woke, the kind of heavy darkness that smothered every inch of the room and made the air feel thick, suffocating. Her chest felt tight, and her heart was thumping in her ears. She sat up slowly, disoriented, the chill of the night creeping over her skin. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 2:13 a.m. The faint moonlight from the window didn't seem to reach as far into the room tonight, leaving the corners even more oppressive, darker. For a long moment, Emma thought she had imagined it, the sound she had just heard, distant and low, like the wind whispering through the cracks of the old house. But it was there again, a voice, faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Emma, Her breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded so close, yet the room was empty, and she was still alone. She turned her head, scanning the shadows and corners, the shifting outlines of furniture that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. Nothing. She was alone. Then the voice came again, clearer, more distinct this time. And it wasn't just calling her name. Emma, come closer. Her skin prickled. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a command, a pull, a force that seemed to reach out to her from the very walls of the house. The words reverberated in her skull, a low, resonant echo that seemed to vibrate to the floorboards beneath her. She froze, paralyzed by the sound. The silence that followed felt even heavier, like the room itself was waiting, breathing with her. Emma's eyes were wide, staring at the floor beneath her. It was almost as if the voice was coming from the very earth below, crawling up from the foundation itself. Come closer. The words wrapped around her, like invisible hands that gripped her mind, urging her to obey. She was trembling now, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The cold had returned, even colder than before, seeping deep into her bones. The air felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. Something was there, just below the surface, beneath the floorboards. The whispers had been growing louder over the past few weeks, more insistent. But this was different. This wasn't a murmur in the dark, a lost voice crying out in agony. This voice was alive. It spoke directly to her, like it knew her, like it had been waiting for her to listen. Emma, come closer. There was no escaping it now. The boundary between fear and curiosity blurred as she felt the pull of the voice. What was it? Who was it? The questions raced through her mind like a storm, but there was only one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cold of the floor sending a shiver up her spine. Her breath quickened as her feet met the ground, and she stood up, though her legs were unsteady. The room around her seemed to shift, the shadows thickening in the corners, the house groaning as if it, too, was waking up. The whispers came again, softer now, coaxing like a lover's plea. Emma, come closer. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, and her hands were clammy as she moved toward the door. Each step felt deliberate, as though she was walking in a trance. She felt detached from her own body, as if the house was guiding her, drawing her into its depths. The air was thick with the strange, oppressive energy of the house, suffocating her with its presence. She hesitated at the door to the hallway. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back and lock the door, to barricade herself away from whatever was calling her. But her feet kept moving one step after another, as though she was no longer in control of her own body. The house creaked underfoot, its timbers groaning as she moved toward the living room. The darkness seemed to swallow her whole, every shadow deepening, every corner becoming more menacing. But still, the voice, so soft, so insistent, pulled her forward. Emma, come closer. She reached the center of the living room, the weight of the silence pressing down on her like 1,000 invisible hands. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned in a low, resonant tone, as if the house itself was acknowledging her presence. Its heartbeat synchronized with hers. And then, from beneath the floor, so close, so real, it came again. Emma, she gasped, stepping back instinctively, but her feet refused to move. She was frozen in place, eyes wide as she stared at the spot on the floor where the whispers had originated. Beneath the old, warped boards, she could feel something, a presence, a force that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The voice was no longer distant or fleeting. It was right there, just beneath her feet, reaching for her, desperate, longing. Emma, come closer. Her pulse quickened, and her mouth went dry. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she was losing her mind, or if there was truly something in the house, something that wanted her to come closer. The fear was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something else, something curious, a gnawing compulsion that drew her to the floor, to the very place the voice was coming from. She fell to her knees in the center of the room, her hands trembling as she reached out toward the floorboards. The house seemed to hold its breath as she moved closer, closer to the whisper that was pulling her in. The temperature had dropped so drastically now that she could see her breath fogging in the air. Her hands were numb as she pressed them against the floor, feeling the cold was beneath her palms. It was as though the floor itself was alive, pulsating with a rhythm that was not her own. "Emma, come closer." The voice was louder now, clear as day, its urgency unmistakable. It was so close, she could almost touch it. Her fingers curled into the gaps between the floorboards, pulling them apart, feeling it would give way beneath her touch. The whispers were a roar now, loud, demanding, filling her entire being. And then, just as her fingers broke through the floor, a cold, sharp hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her down. Her breath caught in her throat as the world around her blurred. The air seemed to warp, the walls folding in on themselves. The last thing she saw before her vision went black was a pair of pale, outstretched fingers emerging from the hole in the floor. "Help me," the voice whispered. But now, it was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream. The air in the basement was thick with dust. Each breath she took seemed to gather layers of ancient time on her lungs, heavy with the scent of rotting wood and mildew. The basement, with its low ceiling and cobweb-draped corners, felt like a place forgotten by time itself. The dim light from the single bulb overhead flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, making every piece of decaying furniture seem like it was holding some long-buried secret. Emma stood in the middle of the room, the floor creaking under her weight, as if the house itself was groaning in its sleep. She'd come down to the basement to fetch an old photo album, the one her grandmother had mentioned just that morning while sitting on the porch. But now, the album seemed unimportant. The longer she stood there, the more her attention was drawn to something else. In the far corner of the basement, tucked behind a towering stack of forgotten furniture, an old dresser, a rusted chair, and what looked like an ancient rocking horse, there was a door. It wasn't like the others in the house. The basement had several doors leading to different storage rooms, most of which had warped with age and time. But this one was different. It was new. There were no peeling edges, no discoloration from years of neglect. The wood was smooth, almost pristine, and the brass handle gleamed in the dull light. At first, Emma thought it might just be another forgotten room. Maybe one of the house's original owners had installed it and never had the chance to finish it. But then, as she stepped closer, a chill ran down her spine. It was too perfect, too out of place, and something about it seemed to call to her. Her heart began to race, a strange feeling of anticipation curling in her chest. She didn't know why, but she was drawn to that door. She couldn't stop looking at it. Her feet moved forward almost against the will, guided by some unseen force. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold brass handle. But just as she was about to turn it, she froze. Fear, sharp and sudden, gripped her chest. It was a visceral, gut-deep panic that made her heart hammer and her breathing shallow. She couldn't explain it, but everything in her told her not to open that door. Something was wrong. Something was waiting behind it. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling. She glanced around the room, as though looking for reassurance from the dilapidated furniture, the old wooden beams, or the half-broken staircase leading up to the first floor. But there was no comfort to be found here, only the eerie silence that seemed to press in on her from all sides, wrapping around her like an invisible fog. Emma backed away from the door slowly, her feet dragging against the floor. She turned her back to it and made her way toward the stairs, but each step felt heavier than the last. A part of her, no, something inside her, wanted to run, to escape from this place that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a home. But another part, the part she couldn't ignore, urged her to turn back. She stopped at the base of the stairs, facing the dimly lit room. Her heart still raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just left something important behind. The door, it was calling to her. She could feel it, even from here, like the house itself was whispering a secret she wasn't supposed to know. Her feet refused to move. She stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in on her, until finally, the decision was made for her. With a sharp intake of breath, Emma turned and walked back toward the hidden door. The closer she got, the stronger the sensation of dread became. It was like the room had shifted, like the air had thickened and the light had dimmed just slightly, as if, by approaching, she had disturbed something that had been lying dormant for a long time. She reached the door again and stood before it. Her hand, trembling, reached out and gripped the handle. She had no idea what was behind it, but a strange mix of fear and curiosity surged through her, an almost uncontrollable urge to know, to open it and face whatever lay hidden beyond. The handle was cold, almost icy against her skin. She twisted it, and for a moment, nothing happened. It felt stuck, as though the door hadn't been opened in decades, or perhaps even longer. She gave another push, and this time, it gave way. The door creaked open slowly, a long, groaning sound that seemed to echo through the silence of the basement. The air that wafted out was cold, like a draft from some deep, forgotten place, and it carried with it the faintest smell of earth and decay. The room beyond the door was dark, but not like the rest of the basement. This darkness was thick, as though the shadows themselves were waiting for her, moving in the corners of the room like sentient things. It was hard to make out anything in the gloom, but Emma could see shapes, vague and indistinct, looming in the blackness. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she took a cautious step forward, eyes straining to make sense of the obscurity before her. Then, just as she was about to step inside, she heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper. It was faint, but it was there. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from inside the room, a voice or something else. Emma didn't know, but the instinct to flee surged up in her once again. The fear was overwhelming now, rushing through her veins like ice water. She wanted to run, to slam the door shut and never look back. But something inside her, something deep and primal, kept her standing there, frozen. She couldn't explain it, but the urge to uncover what was hidden behind that door was stronger than her fear. It gnawed at her inside, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Emma took a step into the room, then another. The darkness seemed to wrap around her, pulling her deeper into its folds. But she pressed on, one step at a time. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to leave, but her feet kept moving. She had to know. And no matter how deep the fear ran, no matter how loud the warning bells in her mind grew, Emma knew she couldn't turn back now. The door had been opened, and whatever lay beyond it had already begun to reveal itself. It was too late to walk away. The attic smelled of old paper, dust, and stale air, the kind of place where secrets were meant to stay buried, hidden beneath layers of time. Emma had been up there before, but never with the intent of uncovering anything, mostly just for storage, for forgotten knickknacks her family had accumulated over the years. But today, something was different. Something had drawn her up there, an irresistible pull, like a magnet guiding her steps. As she rummaged through boxes stacked in the corner of the attic, her fingers brushed against something that felt out of place. It was a small wooden box, half hidden beneath an old blanket. She gently pulled it out, dusting it off. Her curiosity piqued. The box was worn, the wood warped with age, and it had an eerie heaviness to it. as though it had been carrying something for a long time. Inside, there was an old journal. The leather cover was cracked, its surface smooth and faded, the edges worn from years of handling. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and covered in faded ink that seemed to blur the further she turned. But it was the words themselves that caught her attention. Voices from beneath. The phrase was written repeatedly, in hurried, frantic script, as if the writer had been desperate to record it, to warn whoever might come across it. The entries were sporadic, jumping between days, weeks, even months. And as Emma read, a chill settled in her chest, spreading outward, filling her with a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. The journal belonged to the house's previous occupants, the family that had vanished without a trace nearly 20 years ago. Their disappearance had been one of the few unsolved mysteries in the town. No one had ever figured out what happened to them. And over the years, the house had stood empty, its windows dark, its doors locked, as if waiting for something to return. As Emma flipped through the pages, the pieces began to form a disturbing picture. The earliest entries were simple enough. Descriptions of daily life, the usual complaints and observations about the house, how cold it was, how noisy the pipes were at night, how the children would talk about their strange dreams. But as the months passed, the tone of the journal shifted. The voices started to appear in the entries. We hear them again. One entry read, "The children say they're coming from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I don't believe them, not yet, but I can't ignore the sounds. The scratching, the whispers. Sometimes it sounds like a chant." Emma paused, her heart beating a little faster. The words seemed to echo in her mind, like a warning she couldn't quite place. The more she read, the more the journal spoke of these voices, growing louder, clearer, with each passing day. "They're speaking to us," one entry said. "Not just the children now. I hear them, too. I thought it was just the wind at first, or the house settling. But it's not. It's something else. It's calling us. It wants us to listen." The family had begun to change. The father, once a steady, dependable man, had grown increasingly erratic. His temper flared at the slightest provocation. The mother, usually calm and collected, had become withdrawn, distant, as if she were no longer fully present in the world around her. And the children were the worst. "They don't sleep anymore," one entry read. "They say the voices keep them awake, that the things beneath the house are watching them. They say they can hear them whispering their names. I don't know how to help them. The whole house feels wrong." Emma's hands trembled as she turned the page, the air in the attic growing colder with each word she read. The last few entries were scattered, almost frantic. The father had begun boarding up the basement door, one plank after another, as if trying to keep whatever was beneath from escaping. The mother had started writing strange symbols on the walls of the house, symbols that Emma didn't recognize but felt an uneasy connection to. And then, the final entry, the last words the journal's writer had scrawled before they disappeared. "We can't escape. The voices are everywhere. They won't let us leave. They're coming for us. I don't know how much longer we have." Emma's heart raced as she closed the journal. She had never felt more alone, more vulnerable. The house, which had once felt like an old, familiar place, now seemed like something alive, something watching her. She could almost hear the voices now, just beneath the surface of her thoughts, whispering, beckoning. The journal had spoken of a curse, but what curse could be so powerful, so consuming, that it could drive a family to the brink of madness? And what connection did it have to the hidden door in the basement? Emma knew she had to go back there. The journal had hinted at something buried beneath, something deep in the house itself, something dark that had been waiting all this time. She stood up, the journal clutched tightly in her hands, her mind racing. She knew that opening the door had been no accident, whatever force had drawn her to it. It was connected to the voices, to the family's descent into madness. They had heard the whispers, too. They had been warned, just as she had been. And just as they hadn't been able to escape, she wasn't sure she could either. Emma descended the attic stairs, her mind set on the basement. She had to know the truth. She had to confront whatever had taken hold of this house, of the family before her. There were no more excuses, no more hesitation. The voices would not leave her alone, and she couldn't turn back now. As she reached the basement door, she hesitated, feeling the weight of the journal in her hands. Her pulse quickened, and her thoughts swirled in a dizzying storm. But deep inside, Emma knew there was no escaping this now. The curse had already begun to claim her. With a deep breath, she opened the basement door once more. The darkness beyond awaited her, just as the journal had warned. And this time, Emma didn't turn back. She stepped forward. The air in the basement felt thicker now, suffocating. The same cold draft that had greeted Emma when she first opened the door seemed to have settled deeper into the walls, curling around her ankles and creeping up her spine. She could almost feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, its secrets gathering like a storm on the horizon. The journal had shown her the descent into madness that the previous family had suffered, but nothing could prepare her for what was happening now. As Emma stepped further into the darkened space, the dim light above flickered, casting shadows that twisted and shifted in strange ways. She felt the oppressive presence of something unseen, something ancient, lurking just beyond her reach. The air was stale, filled with the remnants of forgotten years. Yet, the further she ventured, the more she sensed something watching her, breathing with her, waiting for her to notice it. At first, it was only the sound, the faintest scratching, like claws running across the floorboards just beyond her hearing. Her heart quickened, and she gripped the journal tighter, as though its words might somehow anchor her to reality. But then, as she ventured deeper into the basement, it started to happen. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker, a shape shifting like smoke just beyond her peripheral vision. She froze, her pulse pounding in her throat. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just shadows and dust. Nothing that could explain the sickening unease that was building inside her. She took another step, and the vision came again, this time clearer. In the dim light, she saw a figure, but it wasn't quite right. It was a woman, no, a girl, or what had once been a girl. Her features were twisted, distorted as though some unseen force had stretched and warped her body beyond recognition. Her arms were unnaturally long, bent at odd angles, and her face was a grotesque mask of terror, the eyes wide with fear. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Emma staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. Her hands shook as she gripped the journal. This was madness. This couldn't be real, but the fear gnawing at her, the icy fingers crawling up her spine, told her otherwise. "Get out," she whispered to herself, the words coming out like a prayer. But the pull of the house, the pull of whatever was down here, kept her frozen in place. She had to keep going. She had to understand. What had happened to the family? What had driven them to disappear? She turned her attention back to the dark, pressing forward, though every instinct screamed for her to leave. And then it happened again. This time, the vision was of the father. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes hollow and sunken, as if life had been drained from him long ago. He was kneeling, hands clasped together in what looked like a desperate prayer, though his mouth hung open, as though he was trying to scream. The walls around him seemed to pulse, breathing in and out with a rhythm that wasn't quite natural. Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to look away, but her eyes refused to tear themselves from the sight. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body was paralyzed with fear, her legs heavy with the weight of the house's invisible force. She stepped forward, trying to shake the vision from her mind, but as she moved, the father's figure lurched toward her, his contorted form crawling across the floor, his arms snapping at impossible angles. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, but it wasn't a smile, no, it was something much worse. It was a rictus, a silent scream frozen in time. "Please," the distorted figure seemed to mouth, his voice lost in the stillness of the room. "Please help us." Emma gasped, stumbling backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pressed her hands to her head, willing the images to fade, but they only grew more intense. She could see the mother now, her body hunched and broken, her skin like wax, her eyes wide and unblinking. She stood in the corner of the basement, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands reaching out to Emma, but unable to touch her. "Help us!" The mother's voice echoed faintly in her mind, the words trailing off into a dissonant wail, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. "Help us, it's too late for us, but you can still save yourself." Emma could hardly breathe. Her body was trembling, every fiber of her being screaming to flee, to escape the suffocating grip of whatever was haunting her. She turned on her heel, desperate to leave, but the door, the one that always seemed so innocuous, was gone. There was no way out. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows deepening, closing in around her. The basement had become a prison, the air thick with dread, and an ancient, malevolent force that would not let her leave. From the far corner of the room, Emma saw them again, the family, the children, twisted and distorted, their bodies writhing and contorting, their faces a grotesque mockery of the innocent faces she'd seen in the old photographs upstairs. Their mouths stretched wide, not in fear, but in silent screams, their voices too distorted to understand, but their plea clear. "Please," they seemed to say, "don't let us be forgotten. Don't let them take you too." The visions were suffocating now, more than just memories. They were real, bleeding through the fabric of time, clawing their way into Emma's mind. The whispers had become louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices from beneath, begging her to understand, to help, to do something, anything. Emma's knees gave way, and she collapsed on the cold concrete floor, clutching her head, her body trembling with terror. The walls seemed to close in around her, and she felt as though she was being swallowed whole, consumed by the dark. She could hear their voices now, not just in her mind, but all around her. They were coming from the walls, from beneath the floor, from the very heart of the house. "You can't escape," the voices whispered in unison. "You are already part of us." The floor beneath her seemed to shift, and Emma screamed, a raw, frantic cry. The family, their twisted, contorted figures, reached out to her with hands that no longer looked human, and for a brief moment she understood. The curse, the house, the voices from beneath. They had never left, and neither would she. With a final, desperate gasp, Emma was pulled into the darkness, swallowed by the very same fate that had claimed the family before her, and the house, once again, fell silent. The air in the basement felt suffocating now, thick with dread, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from the very foundation of the house. Emma's mind was spiraling, and the visions, the grotesque, twisted figures of the previous family, had become so real, so vivid, that she could no longer tell where the past ended and her present began. Desperation clung to her, a suffocating weight on her chest. She couldn't stay in this place, couldn't stand another moment of being torn apart by these haunting images and the maddening whispers that crawled under her skin. She had to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening here, something that could put an end to the relentless torment she was enduring. The room felt like a tomb, cold and heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The whispers were louder now, so loud it was as if they were coming from the very floor beneath her feet. They pulled at her, each word like a jagged shard of glass tearing through her sanity. Help us, you must know." Emma's eyes darted around the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with malevolent energy, as though the house itself was breathing, drawing her in deeper. Her heart raced, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the visions, they were too much. But something inside her, a raw, primal instinct, told her to act, to do something before it was too late. Her gaze landed on the floorboards beneath her. The wooden planks weathered and cracked with age. The whispers had grown unbearable here, right at her feet. There had to be something beneath them, something hidden, something that was causing this madness. With shaking hands, Emma dropped to her knees, her fingers fumbling desperately at the edges of the floorboards. The air seemed to grow colder still, the shadows around her lengthening, as though the house itself was trying to stop her, to keep her from discovering the truth. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back now. With a sharp tug, she pried at the edges of a loose plank, her nails scraping against the wood. The sound of groaning and protest seemed to echo in the silence, but she kept pulling, the urge to uncover whatever lay beneath driving her forward. Finally, the board gave way with a loud crack, revealing a small, darkened space beneath. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she peered into the hidden compartment. It was small, barely big enough for her hand to fit inside, but it wasn't the size that mattered. It was what was inside. The compartment was empty. At least, that's what Emma thought at first. But then her gaze lingered on the dark substance that coated the bottom. It was thick, viscous, and dark. So dark it looked like tar or oil, but with an unnatural sheen to it. The smell hit her like a wall, a foul, rotten stench that seemed to crawl into her nostrils, sinking deep into her lungs. It was a kind of smell that made her stomach twist, a nauseating mix of decay, sulfur, and something much worse. Something ancient. Emma recoiled, her hand instinctively pulling back as if the substance itself might burn her. But it wasn't just the smell or the appearance of the substance that unsettled her. It was a sensation that washed over her as soon as she laid eyes on it. A prickling sensation under her skin, like 1,000 tiny needles, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers were louder now, no longer faint, but screaming in her ears, drowning out everything else. They were coming from the substance. She could feel it, as if the very air around her was charged with the presence of something dark, something ancient. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she leaned closer, studying the substance more closely. It glistened in the dim light, shimmering as though it was alive. "Please," the voices seemed to beg. "It's too late for us, but it's not too late for you." Emma's mind was reeling. The journal had spoken of a curse, of voices from beneath the house. And now she was here, staring at whatever had been hidden for so long. The substance seemed to pulse, almost as if it were breathing, alive with its own dark power. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just some ancient stain, some forgotten spill from long ago. This was it. This was the source of the curse. The thing that had driven the previous family to madness. The thing that had been waiting all these years for someone to find it. But what was it? And why had it been hidden beneath the floorboards, concealed in this forgotten corner of the basement? The voices, now a cacophony in her ears, seemed to respond to her thoughts. Their whispers swirled around her, pulling at her, urging her to touch it, to understand it, to embrace the truth that had been buried here for so long. The last remnants of the family, their anguish, their desperation, had been tied to this foul, dark substance. And now, Emma had found it. But what would happen if she reached into it? If she dared to touch it? Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and the fear, that unrelenting, suffocating fear, clawed at her insides. She had to know. She had to understand what had happened to the family. What had happened to them. To her, the journal had spoken of the curse, of the voices, of something that had come from beneath, something that had claimed them all. But as Emma's fingers hovered above the dark substance, a voice, a real, solid voice, spoke at her ear. It was not a whisper, but a distinct command, an order. It was the voice of a man, deep and raspy, like something buried under years of rot. "Don't touch it," the voice said, a warning thick with urgency and dread. Emma froze. Her heart stopped in her chest. She whipped around, searching the basement. But there was no one there. No figure. No shape. Just shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, like the house itself was alive. A thing that could reach out and pull her under. "Please," the voice continued, now more frantic. "It will consume you. It will claim your soul, just like it did ours." Her skin prickled, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The voice of father, was pleading, begging her to leave. She knew, with terrifying clarity, that the substance before her had been the catalyst for the family's destruction. It was alive in its own way, and it had consumed them, one by one, twisting their minds, warping their bodies, until there was nothing left but the echoes of their agony. But why had it come for her? Why now? Emma's mind spun with possibilities, and she felt herself teetering on the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. She couldn't stay here any longer, but she couldn't leave either. The presence of the substance, the whispers, the visions, they were pulling her in, forcing her to face whatever was lurking in the darkness of the house's past. With a cry of terror, Emma pushed herself back from the compartment. The voices screamed in her ears, and the substance seemed to shift beneath her gaze, as if it were alive, waiting, hungering for her. Leave! The father's voice whispered once more, but was too late. She had already touched it. The curse had claimed her, too. The basement seemed to close in on Emma as the darkness deepened around her. But it wasn't just the shadows that were suffocating her now. The very fabric of time had begun to distort, as if the house was bending reality itself. The more she tried to make sense of her situation, the harder it became to hold on to anything concrete. At first, it was subtle, a strange disorientation when she glanced at the clock, a feeling that something was out of sync. She'd spent hours down in the basement, staring at the strange, dark substance, unable to tear her gaze away, as if it were pulling her into its depths. But when she finally forced herself to look up, her heart skipped a beat. The clock on the wall read noon. "How long have I been here?" she whispered, the words barely forming in her mouth. It didn't make sense. She remembered opening the compartment, recoiling the foul smell, and hearing the father's voice plead with her to leave. But the time was wrong. She hadn't been down here for hours. Had she? The disorienting sensation gnawed at her. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind, but her thoughts felt like they were slipping through her fingers, the memory of what she'd been doing just moments ago fading into a haze. Her chest tightened with panic, but before she could gather herself, she felt the strange pull again, urging her to stay, urging her to understand. And then she blinked. The next time she opened her eyes, the basement was different. The air felt colder, and there was an unfamiliar heaviness hanging in the room. The faint sound of the clock ticking echoed through the space, but the time was wrong again. It was dark outside, the windows blocked by shadows, as though hours had passed while she'd been trapped in this strange limbo. It was nighttime. Emma stood up, disoriented, looking around the basement. How had it gotten dark so quickly? She hadn't been down here for long. Her pulse began to quicken, and her breath hitched in her throat. Her mind was foggy, unable to piece together the fragmented moments of her time in the basement. She could remember walking to the hidden compartment, could remember the sickening sight of the strange substance. But what had happened after that? How had the days slipped away from her? Focus, she told herself, but the words felt foreign on her tongue. Every time she tried to focus on something, anything, her mind would betray her, like a dream fading in the waking hours. Memories vanished the moment she reached for them. She was losing track of time, losing herself. She glanced toward the journal, still clutched tightly in her hand. Her fingers brushed over its worn cover, and a jolt of recognition washed over her. She had been reading it, hadn't she? There was something in it about the family, about the curse. But now, the details eluded her. The answers she had desperately searched for only moments ago felt distant and unreachable. She could barely remember why she'd come down to the basement in the first place. The voices started again, creeping into her mind. Not whispers this time, louder, more insistent, almost like a chant. They rose from the very floor beneath her feet, a rumbling hum that vibrated in her bones. She could hear them now, clear and sharp. Join us, become one with us, it is too late. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices weren't just in her head anymore. They were inside her, wrapping themselves around her thoughts, corrupting them. She could feel their presence, invasive, suffocating, slipping through the cracks of her mind like poison. Desperately, she staggered toward the stairs, her feet unsteady beneath her. But as she reached the bottom step, she felt the world tilt. Her vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the room had changed again. The walls looked slightly different, more oppressive, more alive, and the air was thick with musty, decaying scent. The time was wrong again. "Is this real?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the thick, stagnant air. It felt like the house was bending around her, playing tricks with time. She glanced at the clock again. It read 11:55 p.m. How could that be? Hadn't she just seen noon? Her body felt as if it had been awake for days, but the passage of time itself seemed to stretch and contract in maddening ways. And then she felt it, a presence. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, there was nothing, but as her eyes flickered over the room, she saw them, shadows, like figures that didn't belong, figures that shouldn't have been there. They flickered in her peripheral vision, twisted and bent at impossible angles, just like the family in her visions, but they weren't exactly them. They were distorted versions of herself. She blinked again, and suddenly they were closer. There were more of them now. The shapes and the shadows, the figures, were all around her, standing motionless. Some of them were standing upright. Others crouched low to ground, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of desperation and hunger. She could see her own face staring back at her. Only it wasn't her face. It was contorted, warped, eyes wide with fear, mouth stretched in a silent scream. She gasped, staggering back, but the shadows followed her. She could hear their thoughts. No, her thoughts, echoing in her head. They were fragments of memories, disjointed and broken, overlapping with moments that didn't belong, as though the shadows were feeding on her own forgotten past. You can't remember what you're doing. A voice, her voice, whispered, soft but insistent. Emma's chest tightened as she looked around. The suffocating feeling of being surrounded by herself, by these distorted versions of herself, pressing in on her from all sides. She felt her mind slipping, the edges of her reality eroding like sand slipping through her fingers. "Why can't I remember?" she gasped. Her voice cracked and desperate. The shadows didn't answer. Instead, they swirled, flickering around her as the whispers grew louder, louder than ever before, pounding against her skull, filling her mind with images of the family, twisted, broken versions of them, staring back at her from all directions. They were trying to warn her, trying to help her, but they were too late. They were gone, lost to the same thing that was happening to her now, the thing that had claimed them all. Too late. A voice echoed, the words fading into nothingness. Emma's vision blurred again, and when it cleared, she was standing in front of the hidden compartment once more. The strange, foul-smelling substance was gone, and the floorboard were whole again, as if nothing had ever happened. The house had returned to its quiet, oppressive stillness, but the time had shifted again. It was noon. How could it be? How long had she been here? Emma stared at the clock, her mind reeling. She couldn't remember how she'd gotten here, but somehow she knew it didn't matter. The house had changed her. The voices had changed her. And soon, the time itself would change her beyond recognition. She could already feel herself slipping. The house felt colder than usual that night, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Emma could see her breath in the dim light of the hallway. The walls creaked in the silence, a low, groaning sound as if the house itself were shifting, stretching, waiting. The unease that had been gnawing at her for days had grown into something much worse, a feeling of being watched, of being drawn deeper into the darkness of the house. Emma pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to stave off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. She was tired, exhausted really, but sleep had become an enemy. Every time her eyes closed, the visions would return. The twisted figures of previous family, their contorted bodies reaching out to her with outstretched hands, begging her to join them. The whispers, those horrible, insistent whispers, always seemed to invade her thoughts when she tried to rest. And even in sleep, she could feel the house pressing in around her. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the air felt wrong. As she sat up in bed, clutching the edge of the covers, a wave of cold washed over her. It wasn't just a temperature. It was an oppressive, unnatural cold, as if the house itself had been infused with something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. She shivered uncontrollably, her heart beginning to race. And then she saw it, a shadow, tall, indistinct, but unmistakable, standing in the doorway. The figure was a silhouette, barely visible against the dim light from the hallway, but it was there. For a moment, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It didn't move, just stood there like a silent sentinel watching her. The air seemed to grow heavier. The whispers, which had always been quiet in the background, suddenly rising to a roar. Join us, it's time." Her body froze. She knew instinctively that this wasn't just some trick of the light. This was real. The figure in the doorway wasn't normal. It wasn't a shadow or a reflection. It was something else. Something that belonged to the house, to the curse that had begun to consume her. Something that had been waiting for her to see it. In a blind panic, Emma threw off the covers, her feet stumbling over the floor as she rushed toward the doorway. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. Her hands reached out in desperation, and as she flung the door open, nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. The only sound was a frantic pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. The figure, the shadow, was gone. There was no sign of anyone, no trace of movement, just the cold, eerie stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her body trembling. The whispers had stopped, but they still lingered in her mind, like a low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. Join us. It wasn't just the whispers this time. There was something different in them. The voice had changed, becoming darker, more insistent, more threatening. It was no longer a plea or a request. It was an order, and something inside her, something deep and primal, understood that this wasn't just some fleeting hallucination. Whatever had been waiting for her in the shadows was real. Whatever had claimed the family before her, whatever had twisted their bodies and minds, was now coming for her. The curse was tightening around her like a noose. The chill in the air deepened, and Emma's gaze darted down the hallway, her eyes scanning the dark corners, looking for something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But there was nothing, just a silent, oppressive weight of the house closing in on her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, let me leave." But the house didn't answer. The silence stretched on, suffocating and all-encompassing. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her body tense, her mind a whirl of frantic thoughts. She had to get out. She had to escape this place. But how? The house had already taken so much from her. Her memories, her time, her peace of mind. It was as if the very walls of the house were reaching out, pulling her in, erasing any trace of her old life. Her mind flickered back to the journal, the one she had found in the attic. She had read every word of it, every frantic, desperate entry written by the family before they disappeared. The voices from beneath, the curse, the strange, dark substance beneath the floorboards. She had thought she understood, thought she had uncovered the truth. But now, she wasn't so sure. The whispers seemed to claw at her thoughts, each word sharper than the last, more insistent. "Join us, join us." Emma could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her, like a suffocating fog, clouding her thoughts. The house was demanding something from her. Something she didn't understand. Was it her mind they wanted? Her soul? She didn't know. But the deeper she went into this house, the more she felt herself slipping away. And now, with the shadow figure standing in the doorway, it felt like the house was finally revealing its true nature. Her legs, almost of her own accord, began to carry her down the hallway, away from the doorway, away from the empty, silent space that had once felt like her home. The darkness pressing on her as she walked, the air growing colder, heavier. The house was alive, alive with the curse that had claimed the family before her, and now it was claiming her, too. "Join us," the whispers chanted, a chorus of voices that seemed to swirl around her, filling her ears, making her head spin. The voices weren't just in her mind anymore. They were everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air she breathed. She reached the living room and paused, standing in the center of the room, trembling. The shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, as though they were stretching toward her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the figure that had been in the doorway, but it was gone. For a moment, there was only the silence, the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her chest. Then came the sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. Her heart leapt in her chest as she turned sharply, but there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows. The voices rose again, louder now, a deafening, desperate wail. "Join us." It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. They were closing in on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but the house wouldn't let her. It was too late. She had already felt its presence, seen its figure, heard its whispers. It was as though it had already claimed her, and the realization sank in. She had become part of its dark story. The voices no longer begged her to join them. They demanded it. The darkness was everywhere now, and Emma, standing alone in the center of the room, could feel herself being swallowed by it. The house was consuming her, just as it had consumed the family before her. There was no escape. The whispers were no longer a sound. They were a part of her, echoing in her mind, filling every empty space, drowning out everything else. "Join us," they whispered, and Emma, for the first time, could no longer fight the urge. She closed her eyes, and the darkness welcomed her, claiming her as one of its own. And in the silence that followed, the house stood still, waiting for the next soul to find its way inside. The house had become a prison in Emma's mind, each corner of the sprawling, decaying structure pressing on her. The whispers no longer seemed like echoes of the past. They were a constant, invasive presence, filling her every waking moment and haunting her dreams. They were everywhere now, wrapping themselves around her thoughts, urging her to join them, to embrace the curse that had long before been set in motion. But one night, desperate for answers, Emma's search led her deeper into the house than she had ever gone before. It was in the attic once again. She had avoided it for days, unwilling to confront the strange, foreboding presence she had felt in that space. But now, with the walls of the house closing around her, she knew there was nowhere left to run. She had to know what had happened to the previous family, what had drawn them to the dark forces beneath the house, what had happened to them, and why did she feel the same grip tightening around her? The attic was suffocating in its silence, the heavy dust of years past hanging in the air. But it wasn't the dust that made her throat constrict. No, it was the oppressive way of the house, the sense that something wasn't right, that something dark had been left behind. As she sifted through the old boxes and crates that cluttered the attic, Emma's fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound book. It was out of place among forgotten remnants of the family's life. Too pristine, too new-looking, almost like it had been placed there intentionally. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up. The cover was embossed with strange symbols. Symbols she didn't recognize but felt she should. They were twisted, spiraling shapes, like something ancient, something lost to time. She flipped it open, her fingers trembling. Inside, the pages were filled with hurried, frantic handwriting, almost too difficult to decipher, as though whoever had written them had been pressed for time, their mind unraveling. The writing was the last entry of a family member. The father, perhaps, judging by the handwriting. The words that followed told a story Emma had not expected. One of desperation, of a family who had been drawn into something they could neither control nor understand. The ritual. The family had uncovered something beneath the house, something buried deep in the earth, beneath the floorboards. They had heard the whispers long before Emma arrived, faint and insistent, beckoning them. At first, they had dismissed it as the creaking of an old house, the sounds of the foundation settling. But the voices persisted. They grew louder, more urgent, and soon the family began to hear words, a language unlike any they knew. The voices called out from the shadows, from beneath the very ground they stood on. It wasn't long before they realized that the house itself was alive, alive with a presence that had been there for centuries, perhaps longer. It had been waiting, hungry. The family had made the decision, or rather, the mistake, to summon this presence, believing they could communicate with it. The journal entry revealed the full extent of their desperation. The father spoke of an ancient ritual, one passed down through generations of forgotten occult knowledge. The ritual was meant to allow them to commune with the voices beneath, to harness their power. It promised strength, immortality, and wealth, but at a terrible cost. The voices whispered of great power, of secrets that had been hidden for centuries, of the ability to command forces that no mortal should dare understand. In their ignorance, the family believed they could control it. They were wrong. The ritual itself was to be performed deep in the basement, in the room where Emma had first heard the whispers. The father had written about how they had prepared for weeks, gathering strange items, drawing sigils on the floor, and summoning dark, forbidden forces. Each step had seemed to promise the power they had sought. But when the night of the ritual came, something went terribly wrong. The father's words became more frantic, more disconnected as he recounted the event. It was too late, he wrote. We've opened the door to something far beyond us. It isn't just a voice. It isn't just a presence. It is something older, something that has been trapped beneath the house, beneath the earth, for centuries. And now we are its servants. The words began to bleed together, his writing descending into madness. The ritual had worked, but not in the way they had intended. The voices beneath the floorboards were not mere echoes of the past. They were the very embodiment of the house's curse, a dark force that thrived on the energy of souls desperate enough to listen. The father described how, once the ritual was complete, the house seemed to shift, as if the very foundation had been altered. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were real. The family felt the presence of something pressing against their minds, something that wanted to consume them, that demanded their souls. It is too late for us, the final entry read. The house calls us. It is not just the curse of the land. It is alive. I fear it will take us all, one by one. We will not escape. And neither will you, Emma. The house will claim you, too. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to reach out from the page, like hands clawing at her chest, squeezing her heart. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and the family had been consumed by the very thing they had tried to harness. But it wasn't just their bodies that had been claimed. It was their very souls. The voices had fed on their fear, their desperation, and now, it seemed, they were calling for her, too. She could feel them now, the weight of the curse pressing down on her. The whispers had never been so loud, so demanding. They weren't just trying to lure her. They were forcing her, calling her to join them, to become a part of the house's twisted, eternal story. The house had claimed the family before her, and it was trying to claim her now. Emma stumbled back from the journal, her hands shaking. Her head spun, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. The house, it wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a building. It was a living entity, a thing born of ancient darkness. It had consumed the family before her, and now it was turning its insidious gaze on her. She closed the journal with trembling hands. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, more forceful. They were no longer just coming from the walls. They were inside her head, swirling in her thoughts, drowning out everything else. Join us, join us. With a cry, Emma turned and fled the attic, her feet carrying her down the stairs. But it felt like the house was closing in on her. The darkness that had once been a distant fear now wrapped itself around her like chains, pulling her toward the heart of the house, the basement, where it had all begun. It was too late. The house had already marked her, and now she was part of its story. She could already feel the weight of it, the grip of the curse tightening around her soul, as if it was claiming her piece by piece. And as she stumbled to the hallways, the voices beneath the floorboards grew louder, calling her name. Join us forever. The moment Emma stepped into the hallway, the world around her seemed to buckle. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin, and with every step, it was starting to tear apart. The walls of the house no longer seemed solid, no longer rooted in the physical world. They swayed, undulated, and whispered as if they were alive, their surfaces breathing in sync with the deep, ever-present hum of the house. Her breath quickened, her pulse raced. She couldn't trust her senses anymore. The lines between what was real and what was not had become too blurred. Every corner she turned, every shadow that flickered, felt like a trap, a snare closing in on her. The whispers were louder now, like a chorus rising from the very foundation beneath her feet. They weren't voices anymore. They were screams, agonized wails that grated against her mind, drowning her thoughts in a storm of chaos. The words they spoke were no longer the cryptic whispers that lured her toward the basement. No, now. They were demands, urgent and frantic, each one laced with pain, longing, and hunger. Help us. Please set us free. She froze. The voice was so real, so close. It wasn't just a whisper. It was someone speaking to her. Someone standing behind her, just beyond the corner, with a surge of terror. She spun around, her eyes darting, but there was nothing there. Only the long, dark hallway, stretching endlessly into shadows. But then she saw them. Figures moved at the edges of her vision. Figures that shouldn't have been there. At first, they were vague shapes, indistinct, like shadows caught in the corner of her mind. But as she blinked, they grew clearer, more defined, until the unmistakable forms of the previous family materialized before her. The mother was the first to step forward. Her face was a twisted version of the warm smile Emma had seen in the family portraits. Her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something darker, something desperate. The mother's hands reached out, her fingers elongated and trembling, and her mouth parted as she spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, a voice that echoed with the weight of years spent trapped in the house. Please, you have to help us. Set us free. Emma took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She shook her head, disbelieving. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. They were just figments of her mind, hallucinations. That's all they were, right? But as the mother moved closer, her form shifting like smoke, Emma could feel the cold, unnatural presence radiating off her. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some trick of the mind. These were real. These are the family members who had lived here before her, trapped in a house, twisted and contorted by the very curse that had claimed them. The father was next, his body skeletal, his eyes sunken into dark, hollow pits. His skin hung loosely from his frame, like a marionette stretched thin over the bones of his face. He raised one trembling hand toward Emma, his voice weak and broken, but desperate. "Please, we can't escape. Help us. We're trapped here." His voice cracked as if it were breaking apart, as though the very sound of his pleas were being torn away by an unseen force. Emma's knees wobbled, the floor beneath her feet unsteady, as if the house itself were shaking in time with the pounding of her pulse. She didn't know how to respond. She didn't know what to believe. Her hands clutched her head as if she could push the voices away, force the images from her mind. But the more she tried to resist, the stronger the hallucinations became. The daughter followed, her face covered in blood, eyes wide with terror. She was whispering frantically, her words slurring and broken as she stumbled toward Emma, her once innocent expression now twisted into a grimace of agony. "Please, you don't understand. It's too late for us. The house, the voices, they have us now. But you can stop it. You can stop it before it gets to you too." The daughter reached for Emma's hand, but the touch was cold, like the chill of grave. The skin of her fingers clammy and clamored with something dead. Emma recoiled, but her body wouldn't listen. It was as if her legs refused to move, frozen in place by the haunting, desperate expressions on their faces. The father, mother, and daughter were closing in around her, their bodies shifting in and out of solidity as if they were struggling to maintain their presence, their very forms threatening to dissolve at any moment. "Set us free," the voices begged, over and over again, until it became a chant, a prayer of desperation, a ritual they had repeated for years. "Set us free." Emma staggered backward, her vision swimming as the room around her twisted and undulated. The family's images grew more grotesque with every second, their faces becoming more decayed, their limbs stretched in unnatural ways, their eyes hollow and empty. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls bending and warping, the shadows swallowing everything. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. It was the figure she had seen earlier, the one that had appeared in the doorway. It was no longer a shadow. It had become fully corporeal, standing at the end of the hallway, its shape clear and unmistakable. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, twisted at impossible angles. Its face was obscured by a dark, flowing hood, but its eyes, those eyes, were two glowing orbs, burning with an unnatural fire. Emma couldn't breathe, her chest constricted, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears she could hardly think. The figure watched her. The family continued to circle her, their voices a torrent of pleading, but the figure remained silent, unmoving, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to make a decision, waiting for her to understand what had been asked of her. Emma's mind reeled. She couldn't focus. She couldn't think. The house had consumed her thoughts, broken down every rational thought she'd ever had. The boundary between the real and the imagined had shattered completely. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity fraying at the edges, her memories slipping through her fingers like water. "Please," the family members whispered, their voices growing quieter, more insistent. "Please, you must help us before it's too late for you too." The figure at the end of the hallway moved, its limbs elongated unnaturally, its body swaying with the slow, deliberate grace of predator. The shadows stretched along the floor like tendrils, reaching out to Emma, pulling her toward it. With a scream that echoed through the house, Emma stumbled backward, but the world seemed to spin around her. She could hear the voices of the family, the whispers, the pleas, but they all blurred together, drowning out her thoughts, her sense of self. There was only the house now, and it was hungry. The walls closed in. The house wasn't just the place she was trapped in. It was a part of her now, a thing living inside her mind, claiming her as its own. Set us free. But the question was no longer who she could help. It was who would be the next to join them. And as Emma's vision began to fade into darkness, she understood. The house would claim them all. Emma's mind was no longer her own. It felt as if something, some dark, malevolent force, was slowly chipping away at her very essence. Her thoughts were fragmented, disjointed, and the edges of reality blurred so thoroughly that she could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a twisted manifestation of the house's curse. The oppressive atmosphere, thick with dread and whispers, pressing on her, smothering every spark of defiance she had left. The voices had been relentless. They followed her everywhere. The hollow pleas, the broken echoes of the family that lived here before her, were no longer mere whispers. They were her constant companions. They had become a part of her, a part of the very air she breathed. But it was the floorboards, those weathered planks beneath her feet, that had become the focal point of her madness. They were not just an obstruction, a physical barrier between the house's dark secrets and the world above. No, they were the very anchor of the curse. The wave had pressed down on Emma with every step, and the voices seemed to grow louder, more desperate the closer she came to them. She had been hearing it for days, those faint, distant sounds that seemed to come from beneath the floor. They weren't just creaks or groans of an old house settling. No, these sounds had a rhythm, a pulse, and as she had ventured deeper into the house, her growing obsession with the whispers led her to understand the horrible truth. The voices weren't simply echoes of the past. They were the souls of the family, yes, but they were not the only ones trapped beneath the floor. Something inside her compelled her to act. She had tried to ignore it, to fight it, but there was no escaping the dark force that seemed to seep from the very foundation of the house. The truth was undeniable now. She had to break the floorboards. With trembling hands, Emma grabbed the crowbar she had found in the basement, the rusted metal cold and foreign in her grasp. She knelt down in front of the floorboards in the center of the room, the whispers growing louder and more frantic, a tidal wave of sound that reverberated through her skull. As her fingers dug into the wood, she hesitated for a brief moment. The house felt alive around her, suffocating, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. The need for answers, for some way to stop the torment, pushed her forward. She slammed the crowbar into the gap between two planks and yanked upward with all her strength. The wood groaned, splintering with a sickening crack. Dust rose in clouds, swirling around her like a fog. With each movement of the crowbar, the whispers became clearer, louder, urgently pleading with her to stop. But it was too late. Emma had already pried open a large section of the floor. The sight that greeted her was not what she expected. It wasn't some hidden treasure or forgotten relic, but something far darker, a hole in the earth beneath the house, a yawning void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward, deeper than the house could possibly go. The hole wasn't empty, however. It was filled with strange, writhing mass, a thick, viscous substance that glowed with an eerie greenish light, as though it were alive. The air around it felt heavy, saturated with an unnatural coldness that seeped into her bones. And then there was movement. At first it was subtle, a shift, a tremor, but then it grew more distinct. The greenish substance began to swirl, twisting and churning like a living thing, pulling toward the gap Emma had opened. As she stared in horror, she realized that the mass wasn't simply a vile substance. It was made of bodies. The forms were translucent like smoke, but with recognizable human shapes. Twisted, contorted figures trapped within, their eyes wide with fear and despair. Some were familiar, members of the family, their faces grotesque and warped by the curse. But there were others too, other figures, some faded, some still solid, trapped and lost, their mouths agape in silent screams. They were the victims, The truth hit Emma like a wave crashing against the shore, knocking the breath from her chest. The family had performed the ritual, yes, but they were not the only ones the house had claimed. Every victim that had come before them, every soul lured by the whispers, had been trapped here, forced to become part of the house's endless, cyclical hunger. Each one was doomed to repeat the ritual, to call more souls into the void below, their anguish feeding the darkness beneath the floor. The house had never truly let go of anyone. It had simply consumed them, twisted them into agents of its own damnation, forcing them to carry out the ritual over and over until the cycle was complete. The victim souls had become prisoners of the curse, condemned to lure others into the house, to beg and plead, to perpetuate the cycle. Emma was meant to be the next. The horror of it overwhelmed her, the realization that she was not just another victim. She was part of the ritual now. The house had chosen her, just as it had chosen all of them, and the whispering voices were no longer pleading for her to help them. They were calling her, inviting her to take her place among them, to join them. But Emma refused. She had to refuse. If she didn't, she would become another broken soul trapped in this endless cycle of torment, lost to the house and its insatiable hunger. The air grew colder. The floorboard began to creak, as if the house itself were moving, reacting to her defiance. The writhing mass in the hole began to rise, its horrific forms reaching toward her. She could hear their desperate whispers growing louder, their voices filling the space, echoing off the walls, filling her mind. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their souls desperate to drag her into the abyss with them. But Emma gritted her teeth and stepped back, away from the hole. She knew what she had to do. She had to destroy the house. In the back of her mind, she knew it was the only way to break the cycle, to set the souls free. The ritual, the curse, it had all been born of the house's insidious power. It was alive, and it thrived on the souls it consumed. If she could destroy it, she could free them all. With a final, steely resolve, Emma turned toward the staircase. She knew what had to be done. She would burn the house to the ground. She would rip it apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the scorched remnants of its existence. As she rushed toward the door, the whispers became a scream. The house roared in fury, but Emma didn't look back. The cycle would end tonight. She would not become another soul trapped in its grasp. She would free them. The house would burn. Emma stood frozen in the dim light of the hallway, her body trembling from the cold, the weight of the house pressing down on her like an invisible force. She could feel the thick, suffocating air pressing against her chest, her breath shallow and erratic. The whispers were a constant, maddening hum in the background, but they had grown quieter now, more distant, as if the house itself were watching her, waiting. The hole beneath the floorboard still churned with that sickening, greenish glow, the souls of the lost reaching out from within, clawing at the very fabric of reality. They were no longer just whispers. They were tangible, full of raw, aching desperation. But Emma had made her decision. She knew what she had to do. Burn it down. Tear the house apart. She would end the cycle. But just as she took another step toward the door, toward freedom, something changed. The air shifted, growing colder, heavier, as though something was moving in the darkness behind her. A chill crawled up her spine, causing the hairs on the back of her neck to stand on end. She wasn't alone. From the corner of her eye, a figure appeared, flickering in and out of view like a broken film reel. For a moment, she thought it was just another hallucination, another of the twisted memories of the family, or perhaps some lingering manifestation of the curse. But this figure, it was different. This one was solid, its form distinct, and it was not pleading. It was warning. Emma? The voice was like a breath, soft and guttural, like a long-forgotten prayer. It was low but unmistakable, and it reverberated through the walls of the house. The figure emerged slowly, its shape becoming more defined with each step, until Emma could see her clearly. It was a mother, the woman whose face she had seen countless times in the old family portraits. But this time, there was no warmth in her eyes, no trace of kindness. Her face was gaunt, hollowed by torment. Her skin was a pale, sickly shade, stretched tight over the bones of her skull. Her hands were outstretched toward Emma, but there was nothing comforting about the gesture. No, it was a warning, a plea. "You don't understand," the ghost murmured, her voice quivering with an ancient, unspoken sorrow. "You think you can break free, but the house, it will never let you go." Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, a chill crawling down her spine. The house felt alive, watching, its presence suffocating her. The whisper started again, louder this time, growing in intensity, the voices clawing at her ears. The mother's ghost took another step forward, her form flickering in the darkness. Her eyes, sunken and mournful, locked with Emma's, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Emma felt a connection. It wasn't just a ghost. This woman, this soul had been trapped here, trapped by the house, cursed to wander, to repeat the cycle of torment. "Please listen," the mother begged, her voice cracking. "If you stay, if you don't leave, you will become like us." Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The air around her felt thick, oppressive. The house seemed to breathe with her, inhaling and exhaling with each flicker of the ghost's form. "You'll be pulled into the ritual," the ghost continued, her hands reaching for Emma. "You'll be trapped beneath the floorboards, a part of this house's cursed history. You'll forget who you are. You'll become one of the voices, lost forever." The mother's voice was both a warning and a promise, a cursed fate spoken as if from experience, as if the woman had known this torment all too well. Emma could see the truth in her eyes, the pain, the fear, the eternal suffering. "You're already marked," the ghost whispered. "You've heard the voices, seen the shadows. The house has chosen you. You can't escape it. It will consume you. It always does." The figure wavered, her body distorting as if torn between two realities. Her mouth opened once more, but now it was a soundless scream, her face stretching in agony. The air around Emma grew thick, and the room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, suffocating. "Run, run now, Emma, or it will be too late." The final words hit Emma, like a thunderclap. She could feel the house, the darkness, surrounding her, closing on her, threatening to swallow her whole. The mother's ghost was still there, reaching out, but her form was beginning to fade, her voice growing more distant, as if the house itself was pulling her back, dragging her into its depths. Emma's legs felt weak, her body frozen with fear. The cold was unbearable now, and the whisper swirled around her like a storm. "Leave, Emma. Leave before you're like us." But even as the voice pleaded, the terror gripped her heart. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The house was alive, its hunger insatiable. The souls trapped beneath the floorboards had once been like her. They had been lured in, just as she had. And now, they were trapped in the endless cycle, repeating the ritual over and over, a part of the house's cursed history. The house didn't want her to leave. It wanted her to stay, to become one of them. It wanted her soul. The ghost of the mother faded completely, leaving Emma alone in the hallway, the coldness of her absence a tangible weight on her chest. The voices were growing louder now, the air suffocating, the darkness closing around her. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as the house seemed to pulse in time with her heart. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the floorboards groaning as if in response to the house's anger. The door to the outside world was so close, but the whispers were so much louder. The house wanted her to turn around, to stay, and just for a moment, Emma's will faltered. But then she remembered She remembered the souls of the family, their warning. She remembered the curse that had claimed them and so many others before her. She remembered the promise she had made to herself, to destroy this place, to free them all, no matter the cost. With a cry, Emma broke free from her paralysis. Her legs carried her toward the door, the weight of the house pushing against her every step. She ran as fast as she could, her heart racing, her breath ragged in the dark, suffocating whispers still chasing her. The door was within reach. Just a few more steps, and then she burst through it. The house screamed in the distance, an agonized wail, the sounds of 1,000 trapped souls echoing through its decaying walls. But Emma was free. For now, she didn't look back. And as the night swallowed her whole, Emma knew one thing for certain. She had escaped. The house, the curse, the endless cycle. It would not have her. But the ghosts, the ones who had warned her, they were still there, trapped beneath the floorboards, still calling. And she would never forget, not as long as she lived. The moon hung high in the sky, its cold light casting long shadows over the house. The night was still, except for the faintest echo of the whispers that had haunted Emma ever since she'd stepped foot inside. Every part of the house felt like it was closing in on her. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind rattling the windows, as if the very walls were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a decision. It had been a long time since Emma had thought she could escape. The house, with its malevolent presence, had dug its claws into her, and now it was as though she had been living in a waking nightmare. Every moment, she felt the suffocating weight of the curse that had claimed the souls of those before her, their anguished pleas echoing in her ears. And yet, there was a choice now, a final choice. She had heard it from the ghostly voices, the souls beneath the floorboards, and from the haunting figure of the mother who had tried to warn her. But Emma had to decide for herself. The house, in its twisted way, had given her an ultimatum: destroy it, and free the souls trapped within, but at a terrible cost. Or leave, sealing her fate, and become a permanent part of its cursed history. There was no easy answer. Emma had already been through so much. The visions, the whispers, the relentless haunting presence of the house. It had drained her mentally and physically. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the dark chasm that stretched beyond her understanding. The weight of the decision bore down on her like a stone pressing against her chest. She had made it this far. She had uncovered the house's secrets, learned of the dark ritual that had cursed the souls of the family and countless others, forcing them into an endless cycle of torment. The truth was clear now. The house fed on the souls it trapped, drawing them in, twisting them, and forcing them to play their part in the ritual over and over again. It was a machine of pain and suffering, and it would continue to feed on the souls of the living, forever hungry, unless she intervened. But at what cost? If she destroyed the house, if she burned it down, tore it apart brick by brick, the souls that had been trapped beneath the floorboards would finally be free. She could end the cycle. She could bring an end to the torment they had been enduring for generations. They would be free of the house's grasp. But there was a catch. The moment she destroyed the house, it would release its hold on the souls, and they would be free. Forever. Emma shuddered as she thought about it. The voices, the twisted, tormented forms of the family, and all the others who had suffered, they would be released into the world. The knowledge of their torment, their pain, would flood the earth. Their suffering would become real. It would not just be memories anymore. They would be unleashed. And what of her? If she destroyed the house, Emma knew there was no going back. The moment the house crumbled, the ritual would be broken, but at a price. She, too, would be a part of the story, a permanent part. She would be bound to the house's dark history, her soul locked into its cursed timeline, just like the others before her. If she left, however, she would be free, For now, she would escape the house, the cycle, and the curse, but she would also seal her fate. Her life, her memories, would fade from the earth as if she had never existed. She would be forgotten, but not entirely. Her soul would become one of the house's history, a part of its tortured, endless story. The whispers would claim her, just like the others who had tried and failed to escape. The decision felt unbearable. Emma's heart raced in her chest, her mind spinning as she paced through the desolate rooms of the house. The walls seemed to close in tighter, urging her toward an answer. The whispers were louder now, insistent, calling out her name, begging her to make a choice, to decide. But there was no simple answer. The house was a cruel master. It demanded a sacrifice, no matter which path she took. She stood in front of the fireplace, staring into the dying embers. Her fingers tightened around the small, weathered journal she had found in the attic. The journal of the family who had once lived here. She remembered the final words the mother had spoken before she disappeared. If you stay, you will become part of it. Her mind raced back to the moments when she had seen their faces, the distorted, twisted expressions of those who'd been caught in the house's curse. They had begged her to destroy it, to end the nightmare. But could she really do it? Could she free them, knowing the consequences would be so catastrophic? Her heart pounded as she considered the possibility of freedom. Freedom for the souls, but also for herself. The house had tortured her, twisted her perception of reality, dragged her deeper into its web of lies. She had been chosen, yes, but could she allow herself to become another victim? Could she live with herself if she sealed her fate, if she walked away from this place, leaving behind the agony that had clung to her for so long? The shadows in the room flickered and danced. She thought she saw a figure standing at the doorway. The mother, perhaps, or another one of the ghosts. But this time, the ghost's face was peaceful. She had accepted her fate. The house had promised Emma one thing. If she left, she would be forgotten. Her memory would fade like the dust on the floor. She would be swallowed by the house. But she would not suffer. The choice had always been between freedom and sacrifice. But as the figure in the doorway faded, Emma understood. She had a choice, yes, but what if she didn't have to choose at all? Her eyes found the doorway leading out of the house. Beyond it, the cold night air waited for her. A world outside this house. A chance to escape. A chance to live. But even in the midst of her decision, she knew she couldn't walk away. She couldn't leave behind those souls, trapped beneath the floorboards, forced to repeat the ritual for eternity. She couldn't forget them. She couldn't allow the cycle to continue, to keep feeding the house's insatiable hunger. The agony they had endured was too much. With trembling hands, she turned away from the door, her resolve hardening. The house wouldn't have her. It would never have her, and it wouldn't have them. Emma moved toward the center of the room, a surge of determination rising within her. She would destroy the house. She would end this nightmare. She would free the souls, no matter the cost. As the house trembled around her, the whispers reached a fever pitch, the walls groaning in protest. But Emma stood firm. She took a deep breath and spoke the only word she could. "I'll end this. I'll set you all free." The choice had been made. Now, all that was left was to see it through. The house would burn. The air inside the house had grown thick, pressing it on Emma with an oppressive weight. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, a heartbeat of the house itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind to the broken windows, felt like an accusation. It was as if the house was alive, a sentient being that had been watching, waiting for this very moment. Emma stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders. She had made up her mind. She would destroy the house. She would break the cycle, end the torment, and free the souls trapped beneath the floorboards, no matter the cost. The house, however, had no intention of letting her go that easily as she stepped toward the fireplace, where the ancient ritual had begun so many years ago. The floorboards beneath her feet began to tremble. The whispers, which had been growing louder and more desperate by the hour, now turned into an eerie chant. The voices of the trapped souls, twisted and distorted, filled her ears, each one urging her to stop, to leave before it was too late. But Emma couldn't turn back now. She could feel the weight of their suffering, the decades of pain and anguish that had been trapped here, pulling at her heart. The cycle had to end. She wouldn't let the house claim another soul. With trembling hands, she picked up the old journal, the one she found hidden in the attic, and opened it to the final pages. The words of the previous family were etched there in frantic, desperate writing, detailing the ritual they had performed, the pact they had made with a malevolent entity beneath the floorboards, the curse they had unleashed. It was clear now, the entity wasn't just some spirit or ghost. It was a force of darkness, an ancient evil that fed on the souls of the living. It had been lying in wait beneath the house for centuries, feeding off the energy of those who had entered its domain. The house itself was an extension of this entity's hunger, a vessel through which it could draw more and more souls into its grasp. Emma knew what she had to do. With one last glance at the door, at the freedom that lay beyond, she took a deep breath and made her way toward the center of the room, where the floorboards were weakest. The room seemed to darken around her, the air thickening as the malevolent presence beneath the house stirred. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of pleading voices, some familiar, some completely foreign. They tried to reach her, to sway her decision, but Emma was resolute. She had come this far, and she would see it through to the end. The floor beneath her feet cracked and groaned as she raised a crowbar she had taken from the basement. With all the strength she could muster, she slammed it into the wooden planks, prying them apart with a sickening screech. The house seemed to shudder in response, the walls vibrating as though in pain. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and the ground beneath Emma's feet began to tremble violently. The house was fighting back. A low, guttural growl emanated from beneath the floorboards, and the shadows in the room twisted, stretching like living things. The walls seemed to close in, the windows rattling as if the house itself were holding its breath. Emma's hand shook as she lifted the crowbar again. But this time, something more powerful than fear surged through her, a fierce determination, a final resolve to see this through. She could hear the voices now, but they were no longer pleading for help. They were demanding she stop. "You can't destroy it," they whispered, their voices a chorus of desperation. "You'll become part of it. You'll be trapped beneath the floorboards forever." Emma's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the darkness around her deepened. The air felt thick with malice, the weight of the house's presence pressing down on her. The entity beneath the floorboards was rising, awakening. She could feel it clawing at her mind, trying to drag her down into the darkness with it. But Emma refused to yield. She couldn't. Not now. With a final, defiant roar, she drove the crowbar down into the floorboard with all her might, ripping through the wood until it splintered wide open. And then the house screamed. The ground beneath her shook violently, the air turning cold as an unnatural darkness poured up from the hole. A vast, swirling mass of shadows and writhing forms emerged from the crack, twisting and shifting like a living, breathing nightmare. The entity was real. It had been waiting for this moment, its insidious hunger pushing against the very fabric of reality. Its form was impossible to comprehend. A black, formless mass of swirling energy, tendrils reaching out like grotesque hands, trying to wrap around Emma. The floor groaned and cracked beneath her feet as the darkness surged upward, threatening to engulf her. The voices of the trapped souls shrieked in agony, their forms distorted and flickering within the black mass, as though they were being pulled back into the abyss. Emma staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her grew heavy, oppressive, as the house seemed to fight her every step. The malevolent force beneath her feet was trying to pull her under, to drag her into the very void it had created. But Emma wasn't going to give in. She wasn't going to let it win. With a final, desperate cry, she reached the matchbox she had taken from the kitchen, the last tool in her arsenal. The entity writhed, sensing her intent, and the air seemed to snap with energy as it surged toward her. She struck a match, the small flame flickering as it caught, without hesitating. Emma tossed the match into the open hole in the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room erupted in blinding, searing light. The floorboards groaned as fire shot up underneath, engulfing the entity in an inferno of pure, scorching heat. The house screamed again, a terrible, guttural wail that seemed to shake the very foundation of reality. The fire spread quickly, devouring the darkness, consuming malevolent force that set on the souls of the living for so long. The walls cracked and splintered as the house began to burn, its ancient timbers catching flame. The once immovable structure now crumbling into ash. Emma stumbled back, the heat from the fire intense, but she didn't look away. She watched as the house died, as the curse that hurt so many souls trapped for so long was finally broken. The floorboard beneath her feet cracked and splintered as the entity beneath the house gave one last, anguished scream. The souls, twisted, broken, and battered by years of torment, were released into the flame, their forms dissipating like smoke, free at last. Emma collapsed on her knees, gasping for breath, the weight of destruction falling over her like a tidal wave. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. The house was burning. But Emma, she was free. And the ghosts? They were finally free as well, as the fire consumed the last remnant of the house. Emma knew that the curse had been lifted. There would be no more whispers, no more nightmares. The cycle was over, but in the deep, dark recesses of her mind, she would never forget the price they had all paid. The fire had done its work. The house was nothing but a crumbling skeleton. The smoke rising like a twisted ghost into the cold night sky. Emma stood just beyond the scorched rain, her eyes fixed on the remnants of a once grand structure. The oppressive weight that clung to her for so long had finally lifted, but in its place was a deep emptiness, a hollow feeling, like the absence of something she couldn't name. She had destroyed the house. She had freed the soul trapped within it, and yet the emptiness in her chest refused to fade. The flames still licked the air, orange and red, but the night was quiet now. The oppressive atmosphere that had choked the house for so long was gone. No more whispers, no more voices pleading for relief. Only silence. Emma turned away from the burning house, pulling her coat tighter against the chill of the night. The cool wind cut through her, but it felt refreshing as it was cleansing her skin. She had escaped. She was free. Her legs felt weak beneath her, like the ground itself had been sapping her strength and might, maybe even years. She had no destination in mind, just the urge to get away, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that place. The curse was broken. The house was burned to ground, and she could finally start to heal. As she took a few more steps, her body trembling with exhaustion, Emma heard a sound that made her flee. It was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "We are still here." Emma's heart stopped. Her blood ran cold, and she felt the familiar weight of dread sink deep in her stomach. She knew that voice. It was the same voice she had heard beneath the floorboards, the same voice that had whispered to her in the dark, the voice of the house, the malevolent entity that had haunted her every step. She turned back toward the remains of the house, her breath catching in her throat. The fire crackled and hissed, its warmth still radiating against the night air. But there was something else, something wrong in the air, something she couldn't place. The house was burned. It should have been gone. It was gone. She had destroyed it. She had seen it with her own eyes. The flames had consumed the entity, torn apart the very foundation of the house. But the whisper had come from the air itself, and not from the ruins. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her coat, and she stepped back cautiously, every instinct in her body screaming at her lungs to get as far away as possible from this place. She had broken the cycle. Hen-chi? Hen-chi? The whisper echoed again, this time louder and clearer, as if the words were carried on the wind, like a message that had been buried beneath the surface for too long. We are still here, and you are not free. Emma felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The earth seemed to tremble, as if the very land was responding to the entity's call. The firelight flickered and twisted, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own, like the hands of the very soul she had freed. But now they weren't just shadows. They were alive. They were reaching out toward her. Her pulse quickened as the weight of the implication hit her all at once. The house had burned, but the curse hadn't ended. The entity, the malevolent force beneath the floorboard, was still alive. It had found a way to survive the fire, to reach beyond the boundaries of the house. And worse, it seemed to be calling out to something, someone, to continue its work. Emma stumbled backward. Her mind wrestled. She had thought she had finished it. She had thought that by destroying the house, by breaking the cycle, she had freed the souls, had destroyed the source of the curse. But now she wasn't so sure. The wind howled around her, the air thickening with strange, oppressive energy. The fire continued to burn, but it was no longer accompanying wind. It felt wrong, like the fire itself had been consumed by something darker, more insidious. The whispers came again. This time, they weren't just a distant sound. They surrounded her, curling around her like a serpent's grip. We are still here, and you will never escape. The words twisted in her mind, burrowing deep into her thoughts, beating on her feet. Emma clutched her head, trying to shake the feeling. But it was as though the whispers had become a part of her. They were inside her head now, alive in the silence that followed. She couldn't understand. She had done everything right. She had followed the ritual. She had destroyed the house. The house had been gone. But as she stood there in the darkness, surrounded by the flames, she realized an awful truth. The curse wasn't tied to the house. The house had been nothing but a vessel, a conduit. The curse itself, whatever malevolent force it created, had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to destroy the vessel, so it could escape. The house had only been beginning. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. She had thought she was done, but she could feel it now, the dark presence that lingered just beyond the edges of her vision. The cycle hadn't been broken. It had shifted, and now it was unplanned more. She could hear the whisper again, now sharper like a blade in her mind. You think you've broken cycles? You think you've freed them? There's no escape. You are ours now. Her knees buckled beneath her. The weight of the realization crashing down on her. The entity was free. Free to spread, to infect others, to lure them into the same trap that had claimed her, just as it had claimed the souls before her. But there was something else, something more terrifying than the curse itself. She had felt the enemy's presence beneath the house, and now she could sense its reach expanding, stretching beyond the remnants of the house, out into the world. She wasn't just running from the house anymore. She was running from something far away. The ground seemed to pulse beneath her, and she staggered backward. But the world around her had begun to blow. The air was thick, the whispers deafening. She could no longer see the distant trees or the horizon. Everything was swallowed by the shadows, the darkness that spread to the very pit of the earth. And in that moment, Emma understood. The house was only something. The curse was something older, something far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how many times the house was destroyed, it would always come back. It would always find its next victim and say, Emerald. She ran into the darkness, the final whisper echoing in her ears. We are still here. And she realized with a sickening certainty that the curse would never end. It would never be over. Not for her. Not for anyone. Because the house, the cycle, was never finished. It had just begun to be.